He tried to push her away, but this overlooked woman's courage made him choose her over everything. The overlooked woman and the broken cowboy. The strongest hook. The letter arrived in Colorado Springs on a Tuesday that changed everything. But Sarah didn't know it yet. She stood in the cramped office of the Silver Creek Trading Company, her worn gloves clutching a piece of paper that might as well have been a death sentence. Her boss, Mr. Hendricks, wouldn't meet her eyes. That was never good. "I'm letting you go," he said flatly, shuffling papers on his desk. "Too many complaints from customers. They say that you're strange. Quiet. You don't smile enough when you take their orders." Sarah had worked at the trading post for 3 years. 3 years of arriving before dawn to organize inventory, of carefully tallying accounts, of helping ranchers find supplies they needed at prices they could afford. She'd saved lives with her practical knowledge, recommending antiseptic for infected wounds, suggesting nutritious foods for pregnant women, advising on tools that would actually last. But none of that mattered. She was 32, unmarried, and in a valley where a woman's worth was measured by her husband's cattle count, and her willingness to smile while men decided her fate. "I don't have anywhere to go," Sarah whispered. She'd sent every penny she could to her sister in California. She had perhaps 2 weeks of food money left. "Not my concern," Hendricks said, finally looking at her with something like pity. "Pack your things." As she walked through the snow toward the small room she rented above the bakery, Sarah saw the way people looked at her. They always had. The pity. The dismissal. She was the woman whose parents died in a wagon accident when she was young. The girl raised by an aunt who tolerated her but never quite wanted her. The woman who was too intelligent for her own good, too practical, not pretty enough to overlook her sharp tongue. No one wanted her. Not really. That's when the horse appeared. It came down the mountain road like it was fleeing something terrible, its dark coat matted with snow and sweat. No saddle. No bridle. Just a wild-eyed animal in pure panic. People scattered from the main street, shouting warnings. The horse reared, nearly trampling old Mrs. Chun, who stood frozen in shock. Sarah didn't think. She just moved. She stepped into the horse's path, hands up, eyes calm. Everyone shouted for her to get away. But Sarah heard the fear underneath the panic in the animal's cries. She'd grown up around horses. She understood their language better than she understood people's. "Easy," she said softly, taking another step closer. "Easy, beautiful. You're safe now." The horse reared again, its hooves inches from her face. One strike could crush her skull. Crush her like everyone had tried to do for 32 years. Quietly, without malice, but completely. "I know you're scared," Sarah continued, her voice steady. "I know you've been hurt. But you're not alone anymore." Something in those words reached the animal. The horse's ears twitched. Its breathing slowed. Sarah kept talking, kept moving closer, kept offering the only thing she really had to give, her presence. Her refusal to be afraid. The horse finally lowered its head. Sarah caught its mane and led it toward the livery, the entire town staring after her like she'd done something impossible. When she handed the animal to the stable master, he recognized it immediately. "This is Smoke," he breathed. "This is Eli Mercer's horse." Sarah's stomach tightened. She knew the name. Everyone did. Eli Mercer was the kind of man that made even unmarried women blush. A loner who'd built a successful ranch in the high country, who didn't come to town often, who spoke even less than Sarah did. He was also known for something else. 3 years ago, his fiancée had left him. Some said she couldn't handle the isolation. Others whispered that Eli had a darkness in him, a coldness that no woman could warm. "His horse just showed up?" the stable master asked, confused. "It was fleeing something," Sarah said quietly. "The mountain cabin." Eli Mercer found her the next morning. She was at the trading post. Well, not anymore, she had to remind herself. She was sweeping the snow from the bakery steps, taking any work she could find, when she heard the hoofbeats. Heavy. Determined. The sound of a man on a mission. He sat tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered in a weathered coat, his hat pulled low. When he looked at her, his eyes were storm-colored and unreadable. "You brought in my horse yesterday." Sarah straightened, meeting his gaze. Most women looked away from men like Eli Mercer. Not Sarah. Your horse was terrified and injured. Someone had ridden it hard. Eli's jaw tightened. I didn't ask you to rescue it. No, Sarah agreed. You didn't. But it needed help. For a long moment they just stared at each other. The snow fell softly around them. Finally, Eli spoke again, and something in his tone had shifted. Not warmth exactly, but less cold. Come with me to my ranch. I need to understand what spooked Smoke. And I want to know how you did what you did. Sarah's heart hammered. Why? Because I've never seen anyone calm that horse. Because you didn't flinch when it could have killed you. And because... He paused, studying her face. Because I'm tired of being alone with questions. It should have seemed dangerous. A woman riding alone with a stranger into the mountains. But Sarah had learned something the day before. Courage wasn't about being unafraid. It was about moving forward anyway. Let me get my coat, she said. Into the high country. The ride to Eli's ranch took 2 hours through terrain that grew wilder the higher they climbed. Sarah had rarely left the valley. She'd certainly never been to the high country. The mountains rose around them like silent giants, their peaks lost in snow clouds. The silence was profound. Just the crunch of snow beneath hooves, the creak of leather, the sound of their breathing in the cold air. She discovered that Eli noticed things. He slowed when her fingers looked too cold, offering her gloves that swallowed her hands. He pointed out a golden eagle tracking prey in the white sky. He mentioned that the cabin was warm, that she wouldn't need to worry about the cold. When they arrived, Sarah's breath caught. The cabin was beautiful in a stark, honest way. Logs notched perfectly at the corners. A stone chimney rising from the roof. Windows positioned to catch light and views. Inside it was spotless but lived in. A rifle cabinet. Shelves of books. A wood stove that glowed warm and red. This is your home? Sarah asked, unable to hide her surprise. Is that a problem? Eli asked quietly. No. It's perfect. Most men wouldn't bother with beauty out here. They just have a shelter. I'm not most men, Eli said, and there was something in his voice that made Sarah look up. And I've learned that surviving isn't the same as living. He offered her tea by the fire. Then unexpectedly he asked her to tell him everything about the horse. Sarah described the panic in Smoke's eyes, the way she'd recognized trauma, how her calm had offered the animal permission to trust. As she talked, she watched understanding dawn in Eli's expression. Someone hurt him, Eli said finally. Yes. Badly. Eli stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered mountains. When he spoke, his voice was raw. 3 days ago, rustlers came through my property, tried to steal my breeding stock. I chased them off, but... He turned back to her. But I pushed Smoke too hard. I was angry. I didn't stop to think about what I was doing to him. I only thought about what they were trying to take. Sarah understood what he wasn't saying. He wasn't just talking about the horse. You hurt him without meaning to, she said softly. Eli nodded, misery crossing his face. And now I don't know if he'll ever trust me again. Sarah stood. Show me where he is. ### redemption in the barn. The barn was warm and spacious. Smoke stood in a stall, his coat gleaming from Eli's careful grooming, but his eyes were still wary. The moment Eli approached, the horse turned away. Sarah watched the pain flash across Eli's face. A strong man, broken by the knowledge that his strength had caused damage. Let me try, Sarah said. She didn't ask permission this time. She simply moved into the stall and stood beside Smoke, not touching him, not demanding anything. She just stood there, present, waiting. Talk to him, she said to Eli. What? Tell him what you're feeling. Not words he understands tone, emotion, intention. Tell him the truth. Eli's voice cracked as he spoke. I'm sorry, boy. I was cruel without meaning to be. I was lost in my own anger and I didn't see you anymore. You were just a tool to me in that moment and you didn't deserve that. You deserve better. The words hung in the quiet barn. Slowly, Smoke's ears twitched. He turned his head slightly, nostrils flaring as he caught Eli's scent. The horse took a tentative step toward him. Eli's eyes filled with tears. Sarah watched as the man and the horse found their way back to each other, and something shifted in her chest. She understood in that moment that Eli Mercer was the same as that horse. Hurt. Scared. Carrying pain he hadn't meant to cause himself. When Eli finally turned to her, the storm in his eyes had cleared into something else entirely. "Stay," he said. "Please. I'll pay you. I need someone who understands things the way you do." Sarah should have been careful. Should have said no. Instead, she thought of her empty room above the bakery. Her empty desk at the trading post. The way everyone looked through her like she wasn't quite real. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." The night everything changed. Sarah had been at Eli's ranch for 5 days when the storm hit. She'd been productive, efficient. She'd reorganized his supplies, started a garden plans for spring, begun training his young horses with the same calm confidence she'd shown Smoke. Eli watched her work, fascination in his eyes and something else. Something tender. But 5 days of isolation, of proximity, of discovering that this broken cowboy understood her in ways no one else ever had, it was becoming dangerous. Sarah could feel herself falling. And falling for a man this wounded could destroy her. That evening, before the storm rolled in, Eli found her preparing dinner in the small kitchen. "I want to tell you something," he said, his voice rough. Sarah's hand stilled on the knife she was using to chop vegetables. "My fiancé left because I was too much for her. Too serious. Too quiet. Too broken inside. I've spent 3 years thinking that meant I should never let anyone close again. That solitude was safer than risking being abandoned." Sarah turned to face him, her heart in her throat. "But then you came," Eli continued, "and you understood my silence. You didn't try to fix me or change me. You just stood beside me. And now I can't imagine you leaving. Eli, I know it's too soon. I know you might leave anyway. But I need you to know that you're not the woman no one wants. You're the woman I need. You're the woman I choose." Outside, the wind began to howl. The storm that would test everything they just admitted to each other was coming. Sarah opened her mouth to respond when the window shattered. A rock came through the glass wrapped in paper. Eli grabbed it, unwrapping the message with trembling hands. His face went white. "What does it say?" Sarah asked, though she already knew something terrible was about to happen. Eli's voice was hollow. "It's from the rustlers. They're coming tonight. They've taken my northern pasture. If I try to stop them, they're going to burn everything I have." Sarah's blood ran cold. "And if you don't? Then I lose my ranch. Everything I've built." The wind screamed around the cabin like a living thing, angry and hungry. Outside, snow fell thick and heavy. Inside, Eli and Sarah faced an impossible choice. Fight and risk losing each other, or surrender and lose everything. But Sarah was beginning to understand that sometimes the overlooked woman was the one with the answers no one had thought to ask. "There's a third option," she whispered. "But it requires you to trust me completely." Eli looked at her with those storm-colored eyes, and Sarah realized he already did. What would come next would change everything. The clever woman and the impossible choice. The plan no man would trust. "Tell me," Eli said, pulling Sarah away from the broken window. "Whatever you're thinking, tell me." The wind hammered the cabin harder, rattling the shutters. Snow poured through the broken glass like water. Sarah's mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating distances, supplies, the psychology of men who thought they were clever but were really just desperate. "Those rustlers aren't interested in killing you," she said. "They want your cattle and your silence. They want you to be too afraid to testify if the law comes asking. But what they don't expect is a woman." Eli's jaw tightened. "Absolutely not. Whatever you're planning. You don't even know what I'm suggesting yet. Because it'll be dangerous and you're suggesting it." Sarah grabbed his face with both hands, surprising him into silence. "Listen to me. You are the obvious threat. They're expecting you to fight or run. But I'm invisible. I've spent 32 years learning how to be invisible. Tonight I'm going to use it." She laid out her plan carefully, watching his face go through anger, fear, doubt, and finally reluctant understanding. It was wild. It was dangerous. It was the kind of thing that only worked in novels and desperate dreams. But Eli was a desperate man, and Sarah had learned something important. Desperation sometimes looked like opportunity. "If they catch you," Eli started. They won't. Because I know what scared men do. They look for threats. They look for courage. They look for anything that matches their expectations. But a woman alone in a cabin during a storm? I'm not on their mental list of things to worry about. Sarah, I can't risk you. You're not risking me. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing us. Something flickered in Eli's eyes at those words. The realization that Sarah was choosing to stand beside him, not because she was obligated, but because she believed in him. Because she saw something in him worth fighting for. What do you need me to do? He asked finally. ###the distraction. An hour before midnight, Eli rode out toward the north pasture, deliberately making noise, deliberately visible. The rustlers would see him coming. They'd be ready for a confrontation. That was the point. Sarah stayed behind but not hidden. She moved through the cabin with purpose, lighting lamps, opening curtains, making sure anyone watching could see a silhouette moving through the house. A woman alone. Vulnerable. Exactly what the backup crew would expect to find if Eli was occupied elsewhere. She wore Eli's second-largest shirt and stuffed it with bedding to create the illusion of a much larger, potentially armed figure. She'd braided her hair tight to her head and covered it with Eli's spare hat. In the lamplight from a distance she could pass for a man. She waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. The three men came quietly around 2 o'clock in the morning. Sarah heard them before she saw them. Their whispered voices, the crunch of boots in snow, the soft clink of metal. They were professionals. Experienced. The kind of men who'd done this before. Through the window she watched them approach. Now came the part where everything could fall apart. Sarah opened the door before they could break in, the rifle in her hands held with confidence she didn't feel. That's far enough, she said, deliberately lowering her voice, trying to sound rough and male. I'm an associate of Mercer's. He called me in after the first trouble. One of the men, lean and scarred, stepped forward. We're just here to collect what Mercer owes us. He doesn't owe you anything, Sarah said flatly. But I'd be happy to discuss terms with your boss. Which one of you is in charge? It was a gamble. In her experience, men like to assert dominance, like to be recognized as leaders. Even desperate men. Especially desperate men. The scarred one stepped forward. That'd be me. Name's Cassidy. Cassidy, Sarah repeated, nodding respectfully. You seem like a reasonable man. Reasonable men don't burn ranches and leave bodies for the law to find. Reasonable men make arrangements that let everyone walk away whole. She lowered the rifle slightly, not enough to seem defenseless, just enough to seem like she was willing to negotiate. What kind of arrangement? Cassidy asked, something calculating in his eyes. Information. Mercer's got a herd being moved south next week. Valuable stock. You let my boss keep his land and cabin, and maybe we help you intercept that shipment without any messy confrontation. It was a lie, of course. There was no shipment. But Sarah was gambling on something crucial. Cassidy and his men were caught between their boss and the law. They wanted money and safety, not violence they couldn't control. A theft they could hide was better than murder they couldn't. Cassidy studied her face, trying to read if she was lying. Sarah held his gaze steadily. How do we know you're trustworthy? One of the other men asked nervously. How do we know this isn't a trap? Because I'm offering you money and information instead of a bullet, Sarah said coldly. That's evidence of good faith. The wind howled around the cabin. Snow swirled in the open door. Cassidy's men looked nervous, ready to finish this and leave. Finally, Cassidy nodded slowly. We'll tell the boss you've got something worth more than this ranch. But he'll want proof. Then tell him I'll ride to town tomorrow and leave a message at the Silver Creek Trading Company. Tell him to find Sarah. She'll have details. She watched the flicker of recognition cross Cassidy's face. He'd heard the name. Everyone had. The girl who'd calmed the wild horse. The woman who'd suddenly disappeared with the mysterious rancher. ### the return. Eli didn't come back until just before dawn. When Sarah heard his horse, she thought her heart would stop. She'd been pacing the cabin for hours, weapon at hand, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake, if her gamble had failed catastrophically. But it was Eli who appeared, alive and whole, though his coat was torn and blood seeped from a cut across his cheekbone. You fought them, Sarah breathed, reaching for him. They didn't expect me to have help, Eli said, wincing as she cleaned the cut. There was someone else at the pasture. Someone who's been hunting rustlers for the territorial marshal. We drove them off, but Cassidy's group didn't show up at the north end. I came back. Sarah's breath caught. They came here. Just before you arrived. I handled it. She told him everything. The lie about the shipment, the name she'd given them, her disguise and her desperate negotiation. As she spoke, she watched Eli's expression shift from horror to awe to something tender and fierce. You went toe-to-toe with rustlers, he said slowly. In the dark. Alone. I'm still terrified, Sarah admitted. But I couldn't let them burn everything you've built. I couldn't let fear decide our fate. Eli caught her face in his hands, careful of her cheeks, her eyes. You're the bravest person I've ever known. And somehow, I think you've just made this situation 100 times more complicated. He wasn't wrong. Word would spread. A woman had negotiated with rustlers. A woman had stood in a doorway and made demands. A woman had proven herself capable of walking between worlds, tough enough to command respect, clever enough to solve problems that would have stumped ordinary men. When Cassidy's boss finally came looking for the information Sarah had promised, he would find something unexpected. A woman who wasn't what anyone had assumed. And his response would set everything into motion. #### the messenger from town. The rider came 3 days later, when the weather had finally cleared. He was young, maybe 20, and he carried a letter sealed with wax. Eli's hand shook slightly as he broke it open. His face went pale as he read. What is it? Sarah asked, though something cold was already creeping up her spine. It's from a man named Harlowcane. He's dangerous, Sarah. Truly dangerous. He runs the biggest criminal operation in 3 territories. And he wants to meet with you. To discuss the shipment? No. Eli's voice was hollow. To discuss working for him. He says a woman with your intelligence and nerve could be worth a fortune. He's offering you a position. He's offering you money and power and everything you've never had. Sarah took the letter with trembling hands. Kane's handwriting was elegant, educated. His words were carefully chosen. He wasn't threatening her. He was recruiting her. He was offering her exactly what every lonely woman dreams of: value, purpose, a place where someone actually wanted her. You're not going, Eli said, and it wasn't a question. But uncertainty flickered across his face. The doubt that maybe, just maybe, Sarah would choose this instead. Choose power instead of a man. Choose freedom instead of love. Sarah set the letter on the table. He wants to meet tomorrow at the Ridge Pass. Half an hour's ride from the cabin. Absolutely not. If I don't meet him, Sarah said carefully, he'll come here with an army. He'll burn the cabin. He'll take what he wants, which includes me. Eli's hands clenched into fists. Then we run. Tonight. We take what we can carry and we run. Sarah looked at this man who'd been alone so long he'd forgotten how to let someone else choose him. And then what? We spend the rest of our lives running? Always looking over our shoulders. I won't lose you, Eli said, raw and desperate. Then come with me tomorrow. But we go prepared. For what? Sarah smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who'd learned that being invisible meant people underestimated your intelligence. For a negotiation. I'm going to give Harlowcane exactly what he wants. Sarah, no. Trust me, she said and reached for his hand. The way I trusted you. That night they didn't sleep. They held each other in Eli's bed, listening to the mountains breathe around them, knowing that tomorrow would bring either salvation or destruction. And in the morning, Sarah would walk toward the man who could either make her a legend or destroy them both. The choice that changed everything. #### the Ridge Pass. Morning came cold and clear. Sarah dressed carefully, not in Eli's clothes this time, but in her own simple dress, the one she'd worn the day she arrived at his ranch. She braided her hair and left it loose down her back. She wanted Harlowcane to see her exactly as she was. Not a woman playing a man's role, but a woman who transcended the limitations people had placed on her. Eli insisted on riding alongside her, though they maintained distance as they climbed toward the Ridge Pass. Sarah had asked him not to be too close. Cain would interpret protective proximity as weakness, as a woman not confident in her own power. The pass itself was beautiful. A high meadow surrounded by snow-laden pines, the valley spread below like a quilted landscape of brown and white. 3 riders waited for them. One was Cassidy. One was a hard-faced man with cold eyes who had to be Cain's lieutenant. And the third was Harlow Cain himself. He was older than Sarah expected, maybe 50, with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of a man used to commanding armies. He wore an expensive coat and rode an expensive horse, and when he smiled at her it was almost kind. "Miss Sarah," he called. "Or should I say Miss Doyle? I've done my research. You're quite the mystery in Silver Creek." Sarah dismounted from her horse with careful grace. Eli remained mounted, his rifle visible but not raised. The message was clear. "I'm watching. If anything happens to her, you answer to me." "Thank you for coming," Cain said, gesturing toward the center of the meadow. A small table had been set up with coffee and biscuits. "I wanted to speak with you properly, away from men's interpretation of events." It was a disarming move. Sarah recognized it immediately. Cain was the kind of predator who understood human psychology intimately. "I'm listening," Sarah said, sitting across from him. "You have a gift," Cain began, pouring her coffee with surprising civility. "You see the world differently. You solve problems that would paralyze ordinary people. And you do it with such grace that men don't even realize they're being outmaneuvered until the game is already over." "I'm not interested in games," Sarah said quietly. "Aren't you?" Cain smiled. "Then why did you tell Cassidy about a shipment that doesn't exist? Why did you negotiate for Eli Mercer's safety when a woman in your position could have simply agreed to help us, and then betrayed him once you were far from the mountains?" Sarah's blood ran cold. He'd seen through her lie. Of course he had. Men like Cain didn't survive by being foolish. "Because," Sarah said carefully, "I'm not the kind of woman who stays loyal to power. I'm the kind of woman who stays loyal to truth." Cain studied her for a long moment. Then he laughed. A genuine delighted sound. "Magnificent. You're absolutely magnificent. Do you know what I could offer you? Position in my organization. Freedom. Wealth. Respect in places where your sex doesn't define your worth. And what would you expect in return? Loyalty. Intelligence. Occasional betrayal of people who get in your way." Sarah set down her coffee cup. No. I won't work for you, Mr. Cain. Not because your offer isn't tempting. It is. But because I've spent my entire life being chosen by people who wanted to use me for something. I'm not interested in that anymore." Cain's expression hardened. "That's disappointing. I don't appreciate rejection." "I'm not rejecting you," Sarah said, and her voice didn't shake. "I'm choosing myself. I'm choosing a life where I'm not a tool, however valuable. I'm choosing a man who looked at me and saw a person worth knowing, not a skill set worth exploiting." "That man." Cain nodded toward Eli. "He'll hold you back. He's limited. A rancher with a wounded heart. You could be so much more." "No," Sarah said simply. "He won't hold me back. He'll stand beside me. And that's infinitely more valuable than being the most powerful person in someone else's empire." Cain's face went cold. The civility evaporated. "You understand what happens to people who refuse Harlow Cain?" "Yes," Sarah said, standing. "They live free. Even if it kills them, they live free." The moment stretched thin and dangerous. Cain's hand moved toward his coat. Cassidy tensed. The lieutenant's fingers hovered near his weapon. Then Eli spoke from behind her, his voice steady and lethal. "She's got 30 seconds to walk back to me, Cain. After that, I start shooting." Sarah didn't wait for more. She walked back to Eli, feeling the weight of Cain's stare like a physical thing. When she reached Eli's horse, he pulled her up behind him in one smooth motion and turned the animal toward the descent. No shots fired. No pursuit. Cain let them go. It wasn't mercy. It was something worse, recognition that Sarah had already beaten him. She'd made her choice and he'd lost. The smartest criminals knew that killing someone who'd already won was just revenge, and revenge got men caught. ### the aftermath and the reckoning. The ride back to the cabin was silent, but it wasn't the quiet of fear. It was the quiet of two people processing the weight of what had just happened. "Thank you," Sarah said when they reached the cabin. "For trusting me. For coming. For nearly getting you killed?" Eli finished, dismounting with barely controlled fury. "Sarah, do you understand what could have happened?" "Yes. And I did it anyway because I needed Cain to understand that I was making a choice. That I wasn't running from one man's control into another's." Eli grabbed her shoulders, his storm-colored eyes fierce. "You scared me. Absolutely terrified me." "Good," Sarah said. "That means you love me." "I do," Eli said roughly. "God help me, I absolutely do. I love you so completely that the thought of losing you makes me understand why I built these mountains into walls around myself. It's less painful than risking this." Sarah kissed him then, there in the doorway of the cabin, with the snow falling around them and the valley spread below them like a promise. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." ####. 6 months later. The church in Silver Creek was full for the wedding. Sarah wore a white dress that she'd made herself, simple and elegant. Eli wore a suit that probably cost more than he was comfortable admitting, and his storm-colored eyes never left her face as she walked toward him. The woman who no one wanted had chosen to marry the man who'd always chosen her, from that first moment when he asked her to explain her impossible gift. But the wedding wasn't the end of the story. It was a different kind of beginning. Harlow Cain's organization had begun to crumble almost immediately after his encounter with Sarah. Without the profits from his rustling operation, without the respect of men like Cassidy who'd seen a woman stand up to him, Cain's empire fractured. Some said he fled to Mexico. Others whispered that someone else in his organization had finally decided to take his power. Sarah didn't concern herself with it. She'd learned something crucial. She didn't need to defeat her enemies. Sometimes all she had to do was refuse to be what they needed her to be, and their own structures would collapse. 3 weeks after the wedding, the territorial marshal came to the ranch. "We've been investigating the rustling operation," he told Eli and Sarah over coffee in their cabin. "We've recovered stolen cattle, but more importantly we found documents, business arrangements, names. Sarah, we'd like your help. Not as a civilian, as a consultant. You understand the organization in ways our investigators don't." Sarah looked at Eli. He reached for her hand without hesitation. "What would that involve?" she asked. "Intelligence work, mostly. You'd help us identify key figures in Cain's network. You'd help us understand how these criminal operations actually function. We'd pay you. Properly pay you. More than any woman has been paid for such work in this territory." Sarah could have said no. Could have chosen the simple life of a rancher's wife. But as she looked at Eli's face, the way he was looking at her with absolute confidence that she would make the right choice for herself, she understood something profound. True love wasn't about keeping someone small to keep them safe. True love was about standing beside someone as they became exactly who they were meant to be. "I'll do it," Sarah said. "But with one condition. I work with my husband. He's my partner in all things. If the work threatens to separate us, the arrangement ends." The marshal nodded, unfazed. In the mountains, everyone had heard the story of how Sarah Mercer had negotiated with rustlers, had stood up to Harlow Cain, had changed the course of an entire criminal investigation with nothing but her mind and her courage. The last cliffhanger, the future. For 3 years, Sarah and Eli worked quietly in the shadows of law enforcement and high mountain ranching. Sarah became a legend, the woman who could read criminal psychology like others read books. The woman who'd brought down one of the biggest operations in the West through careful intelligence, strategic negotiation, and absolute refusal to be intimidated. But on a cold morning in their 4th year of marriage, a new rider came down from the high country. This one was different. Military bearing, federal insignia. And he brought a letter that made Eli go very still. "What is it?" Sarah asked, recognizing the look on his face. The look that meant the world was about to shift again. Eli read the letter twice, then looked at her with something that might have been awe. "The federal government wants to establish an official organization in the Western Territories. They want someone to lead it. Someone with proven capability, intelligence, and a record of successful investigations. He paused. They want you, Sarah. They're offering you a position of authority. They're asking you to build something entirely new. Sarah took the letter. The offer was extraordinary resources, authority, a mandate to protect the territories from organized crime. Everything a woman with her gifts could possibly want. And if I do this, she asked quietly, then we pack what we can carry and we move to Denver.